Hello and welcome to the AP World History Podcast. This is episode 2, The Earliest Civilizations. So the main focus of this podcast is going to be on Egypt and Mesopotamia, but you'll be reading about all the early civilizations over the coming weeks. It's a good idea, as you listen to this next section, to have the early civilizations chart out so you can take notes on that. The term Mesopotamia is Greek for the land between the rivers being the Tigris and the Euphrates. Geographically, this area is more or less where modern-day Iraq is. Historically, this area was a real crossroads where many different cultures came into contact with each other and mixed and assimilated with each other over a long period of time. One of the features of civilizations identified by Bulliet is cities as administrative centers. In Mesopotamia, cities were far more important than in Egypt. If you look at a map, you can see that Mesopotamia is far more exposed to attack from outsiders than Egypt. Egypt is surrounded by deserts and mountains and seas, and all of these acted like natural barriers. In Mesopotamia, groups of farming families would get together in villages to protect one another, farm together, and share tools with each other. And Mesopotamia as a whole was not initially under the rule of one king. Instead, think of it as a dozen or so independent city-states. And 80% of the population of Mesopotamia lived in city-states, making it the most urbanized society of the ancient world. Stretches of non-farmable land, either desert or swamp, would serve as buffers between the different city-states in Mesopotamia. But nonetheless, disputes over land, over water, over property, often sparked violent hostilities between the neighboring city-states and prompted most of these cities to build walls of sun-dried mudbricks around them. The first group of Mesopotamians you'll need to know about are the Sumerians. And you'll read about them in the textbook. The Sumerians were the first people to develop writing. By around 3000 BCE, there were about a dozen fairly large cities in Sumer, and each of these cities had its own government. So these people were culturally and ethnically similar, but they were in constant disputes with each other over resources and over territory. The Sumerians were succeeded by the Akkadians, who, under the leadership of Sargon of Akkad, the Akkadians unified all the different Mesopotamian city-states and brought them under the rule of Sargon. And the Akkadians essentially assimilated with the Sumerians, so the cultures blended together. After the Akkadians came the Babylonians, who were the first to have a written legal code, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the final group you'll want to know about are the Assyrians, who are notable for being particularly ruthless rulers, and also for compiling written works and creating the first library. So we have the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Can be confusing, but it's best to think of Mesopotamia as simply the geographic area where many people came and went over time. The Sumerians were the first civilization, and I think the following quote sums it up nicely. The Sumerians would create a culture that would pass from people to people, religion to religion, and from language to language long after the Sumerians ceased to walk the sands of the area between the rivers. The other civilization that we'll focus on is Egypt, and when we talk about Egypt, it's not nearly as confusing as Mesopotamia with the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. It's just Egypt, and chances are you know a little bit something about Egypt already. Because unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt was unified very early in its history, and in terms of general timeline, ancient Egypt is divided into 3 major periods, and they're termed easily enough the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And each of these periods is divided by a short intermediate period of outside rule. Now, the Egyptian state centered on the king, or pharaoh. From the time of the Old Kingdom, Egyptians considered the king to be God sent to earth to maintain Mu'at, the divinely authorized order of the universe. The pharaoh was the most powerful during the Old Kingdom Egypt, but over time became more of a symbol or figurehead than an absolute ruler. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia developed in river valleys and depended on the flooding of rivers to produce food in otherwise very dry lands. In Egypt, this river was the Nile, and in Mesopotamia, these two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. However, the Nile has very little in common with the Tigris and Euphrates, so they're very different rivers. The Nile floods predictably, so it's perfect for farming, but it was much more difficult in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates were much less predictable. The floods were much more likely to destroy dikes and to ruin crops. When the flood was too high, dikes protecting the people were washed away. When floods were too low, less food could be cultivated and people starved to death. So it's believed that this difference in environment had a major impact on how people from Egypt and how people from Mesopotamia viewed the world. Picture this. In Egypt, the sun rose every day in a clear blue sky. The Nile flooded every year on schedule, ensuring that there would always be food. Here, we have a depiction of Ra, the Egyptian sun god. Early Egyptians viewed the sky as a vast ocean that Ra traveled during the day. At night, Ra would descend into the underworld and fight off the monsters. When Ra, or the sun, rose in the morning, it represented the triumph of life over death. Rebirth of the sun every day, each morning, and of the river every year suggested that life was meant to triumph over death. The building of pyramids signified that at least some people could successfully make the journey to eternal life. Over time, the Egyptian afterlife, life after death, was opened up to more than just the elites of the society, and a moral element entered into the equation, and immortality or access to the afterlife was associated with ethical living. This image is a depiction of the Hall of Two Truths, and this is where Egyptians came to believe they went after they died. And in the Hall of Two Truths, the deceased's heart was weighed against the shoe feather of truth and justice, and this was taken from the headdress of the goddess Muat. If the heart was lighter than the feather, they could pass on, but if it were heavier, they would be devoured by the demon Amut. This scene depicts what occurs after a person has died. Now, Mesopotamians tended to have a much bleaker view on life. So Mesopotamia, which developed in the context of unpredictable flooding and unpredictable invasions, viewed life as being disorderly, random, and largely subject to the whims and passions of violent gods and petty, vengeful gods. And there was little hope of a better life after death in Mesopotamia. And the gods in Mesopotamia typically embodied the forces of nature, and Mesopotamians believed that the natural disasters that they faced on a regular basis were caused by angry gods. The Epic of Gilgamesh is widely regarded as the first work of written fiction. And the chapter in Bulliet opens with a brief retelling of the story, and you'll also see a section of the story in the primary document section of the unit. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, death is described as a journey down a road which there is no going back. The afterworld is a place where people sit in darkness and eat dust and clay. To avoid this fate, a great king named Gilgamesh sets out on a search for eternal life. But after many adventures, he ultimately realizes that death is the ultimate fate of all men. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, state authority was derived from the lavish lifestyle of elites, impressive rituals and ceremonies, but especially the imposing structures they created. The great monuments, the extravagant costumes and ceremonies were all largely designed to inspire awe in people and to flaunt social status. Undoubtedly, the most well-known monuments of early civilizations are the Egyptian pyramids. An interesting fact about pyramids, they were only built during Old Kingdom Egypt. Why did they stop? Well, it just became too much. They were very difficult to build. They could get the stone, but it was always taking people away from other jobs. The first pyramids were mastabas, and you have an image of one here. And the pharaohs had mastabas built to serve as their tombs. Pharaohs were all very concerned about their legacies, and they had to one-up previous pharaohs. So, a pharaoh known as Djoser had an idea. He wasn't just going to build a mastaba, he was going to build mastabas on top of mastabas to serve as his tomb. It would be bigger and better than any pharaoh before him. Here, we have an image of the step pyramid of Djoser. Djoser's son, Snefru, built on his dad's idea and decided that he too would have mastabas on top of mastabas, but he would take it one step further and have the sides filled in. And after a couple failed attempts, his first try, the pyramid collapsed under the weight. He succeeded in building the first true pyramid, and this is known today as the Red Pyramid, which you can see here. Snefru's son is Khufu, and Khufu builds the biggest pyramid the world has ever seen. So, the second pyramid ever built was actually the biggest pyramid ever built. And what we can take away from this is that the age of pyramid building was not very long at all. Khufu's son was Khafre, and Khafre's son was Menkaure. Together, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure form the Great Pyramids of Giza, with each new pyramid being smaller than the previous one was. So here we have a picture of the Great Pyramids of Giza. That is Khufu in the back, Khafre in the middle, and Menkaure in the front. The largest pyramid is actually the one in the back, but Khafre builds his on a hill, which creates the illusion that it's larger, but really Khufu's pyramid is the biggest. In New Kingdom Egypt, the Egyptians no longer built pyramids, but rather they built obelisks, which are really tall, skinny pyramids. And you can actually find Egyptian obelisks in major European cities, such as Paris, and this one here is from Rome, outside the Vatican. And if you want to find out more about pyramids, there's a much more elaborate documentary in the AP World History TV section. The Mesopotamian counterpart of the pyramid is the ziggurat, and we have a picture of one here. And it's not nearly as impressive as the pyramids, and there's a number of reasons for this. First being, it hasn't stood the test of time like the pyramids have because they didn't have as much stone in Mesopotamia, so these ziggurats were made of mud brick. And secondly, it's unlikely that people in Mesopotamia ever had enough disposable time or disposable income to create something on the scale of the pyramids. Remember, they're always living in threat of invasions, and their food supply is much less certain than it was in Egypt. The development of writing further entrenched state authority, and writing in some form or another developed in all early civilizations, with the notable exception of the Andes. Reading and writing was a skill reserved for elites in early civilization. It's not like all young people went to school to learn how to read and write. Writing was first used for accounting. Writing allowed the government to keep track of who paid their taxes, who owed the temple, and it helped the bureaucracy function smoothly. Writing also gave specificity to law. The first evidence of writing comes from the Sumerians. The Sumerians used cuneiform and sketched symbols on clay tablets. Symbols were given to tangible objects. A goat had a symbol, a pot had a symbol, and so on. Now, thinking of this type of system, we see some obvious problems. First, if every object has a symbol, your library of symbols is going to become way too big. Second, how can you create symbols for abstract concepts, such as fear or love? Now, eventually, somebody's going to change this and say, let's not have a symbol represent an idea, but let's have a symbol represent a sound. And the first people to put a combination of sounds together were the Phoenicians. And you'll read about them in the textbook. And you know now that the learning of language through sounds is called phonetics.